Good afternoon. My name is Brad Jensen. I'm a professor of economics and international business at Georgetown's McDonough School of Business. I'm also a senior policy scholar with the Center for Business and Public Policy. And on behalf of the Center for Business and Public Policy, I'd like to welcome you this afternoon. Okay, the Georgetown Center is a nonpartisan research center devoted to trying to inform and shape public policy on issues at the nexus of business and public policy. We do this by generating ideas, pardon me, and convening leaders, convening business leaders, policymakers, and scholars to discuss issues of interest. Okay, today we are hosting the fourth in our regular series of Georgetown on the Hill forums focused on international trade. Okay, today we're going to take up the issue of can we get a high quality agreement on, in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Okay, we have a terrific panel today. I am not going to introduce the panel, but we'll leave that to our moderator. But I will introduce our moderator, my colleague at the Center for Business and Public Policy, and co-organizer with me of these trade-focused policy forums. Our moderator today is Bob Bastine. For those of you who don't know Bob, he has a distinguished record. He is currently a senior industry fellow at the Georgetown Center. Prior to that, he served as president of the Coalition of Service Industries for close to 20 years. He's also spent time in the Senate. He was staff director of the Senate Republican Conference, Republican staff director of the Senate Committee on Government Affairs. He also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, among other distinguished titles. So I will leave you in Bob's capable hands, but before I turn it over to Bob, I just want to remind you that if you are a Twitter person, you can find this conversation at #GCBPP Trade. Thank you. Look forward to a great conversation.
Thanks very much, Brad. Ooh. Yeah, I'm supposed to remind the panel that in order to speak, you have to press the button right in front of you, and I guess I am a little too close. Thank you very much, and thank you all for being with us today to discuss a hugely important U.S. trade expansion initiative, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The TPP had a very modest beginning in an agreement among a core of really powerhouse economies like Brunei, Chile, Singapore, and New Zealand. Enterprising negotiators at USTR, looking for ways, new pathways for trade's expansion around the halting Doha round, understood the potential of this fledgling agreement and persuaded the core members, these four core members, to open the agreement to U.S. participation. At the outset, many on the Hill and in the industry downtown seriously questioned the value of this initiative. They were people who were exhausted from fighting brutal, bruising battles to implement trade agreements with other small countries like Morocco, for example, or Dominican Republic. I was one of those skeptics. I was brought to see the light by Tim Grosser, New Zealand's very persuasive trade minister, who painted the potential for the TPP in vivid colors. USTR and Tim Grosser and Barbara Weisel were right. The TPP, I think, was a masterstroke, will prove to be a masterstroke. Now consisting of 11 members, including all of North America, the TPP is heralded as a 21st century agreement with enormous potential, tantalizing potential, to be the foundation, the building block for a trade agreement for the whole Asia Pacific and FTAP, a free trade area of the Asia Pacific, a very grand vision. It was from Barbara that I heard the first expression, expressed the phrase 21st century agreement. At that time, I and others wondered what that meant. 2 years later, CSI, the Coalition of Service Industries, from the services standpoint, spelled out the 21st century agenda. In its annual summit, they include challenges to the digital economy, state capitalism, and what to do about it, the promise of an integrated trans-Pacific supply chain, and other weighty matters. Sorry. Now, today we've asked each of our panelists to framing their remarks to consider from each of their standpoints what is the most important objective of the TPP. Are you satisfied with progress being made? What are the main obstacles to achieving the goals the U.S. has set and that you believe are most important? And I'm very pleased to say that we have a really exceptionally qualified panel to discuss these issues with us today. Barbara Weisel is Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and she is the Chief Negotiator for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, among other duties. She has established herself as one of the most effective USTR negotiators in charge of an exceptionally complex and challenging enterprise. Rick Johnston is the Director and Senior Vice President for International Government Affairs at Citi. Rick is one of the most respected and astute business advocates in Washington. He is a co-chair of the TPP Business Coalition and a leader in other business organizations. He has been a commissioner of the U.S. International Trade Commission, International Trade Council to the Senate Finance Committee, and a highly successful lawyer in private practice. Steve Lamar is Executive Vice President of the American Apparel and Footwear Association. He is President of the Washington International Trade Association, and he is one of the most influential and articulate leaders of the Washington international trade community. Ed Gresser is Director of the Progressive Economy Project of the Global Works Foundation. He has extensive experience as a senior advisor to Senator Max Baucus, as senior policy advisor to U.S. Trade Representative Ambassador Charlene Barshevsky, and in top positions at the Democratic Leadership Council. Ed is one of our most influential trade policy thinkers and writers. And what I didn't know until I reread his biography last night is that he used to work for a very distinguished Republican, Silvio Conti, right? Yes, he admits it, who was a very, very influential member of the House of Representatives. We've asked Barbara to take 10 minutes to provide an overview of the most salient issues that she wishes to bring to your attention, and each panelist to speak for 5 to 7 minutes so as to leave time for discussion. So thank you very much for being here, and please welcome Barbara.
Thank you, Bob. I thought I would start for a minute to catch everybody up on where we are on TPP and how we got to where we are for those of you who don't follow this day to day. And I only have 10 minutes, so I'm going to talk fast and go through this quickly, and we can come back if people have specific issues. As Bob said, this is a regional trade agreement that started from an agreement that was known as the P4 that was negotiated by Brunei, Singapore, Chile, and New Zealand. They negotiated an agreement going back to 2006 that was intended as a platform for a free trade area that would grow to countries across the Asia Pacific. They concluded the agreement, and there wasn't a lot of interest on the part of most countries in joining because it was such a small group of countries. But to cut to the chase, we joined. We joined in twice. We joined twice. We joined in 2008 in the Bush administration, and then we reflected upon whether we wanted to continue participation in the Obama administration. It took a year to reflect on our trade policy, and at the end of 2009 decided that we would indeed go forward with the agreement with some specific changes that the Obama administration sought as part of the agreement. Two of the things that we were looking at when we came to continue the agreement under the Obama administration were both the way we interacted with stakeholders and the whole question of transparency, as well as specific elements that would update the agreement to address the kinds of trade problems that our businesses are facing in the 21st century. So that's how we started calling it a 21st century agreement. We were looking at joining the TPP for a number of reasons. First, we were looking at where the opportunities were most significant, and those opportunities were obviously the most significant in the Asia-Pacific, an area with really robust economies that were growing. It is home to 40% of the world's population, and 40% of the global trade is conducted in the Asia-Pacific. So this is an area that we really wanted to see what we could do to strengthen our trade ties. We already had very significant trade ties with the region, but it appeared that there were many countries with which we could strengthen our trade and investment, and we would need to do so through a trade agreement. We also looked at the composition of the countries. If we were going to negotiate a high standard trade agreement, we wanted to select countries carefully. So these were like-minded countries that were similarly interested in negotiating a high standard agreement with us, so therefore a good group to start with. It was an opportunity to tackle new issues that we had not previously looked at in trade agreements, or not looked at in the kind of depth that we wanted to look at here. And we also wanted to consider whether or not we should continue the approach that had been used through most of the previous decade, which was negotiating bilateral trade agreements. And you're all familiar with that. We have been bringing bilateral trade agreements up here for ratification, but to look at something that we could negotiate regionally that would bring a number of countries together into a more significant trade agreement that we could bring up here for ratification. So the goal explicitly by the original P4 countries was to start with a small group of countries and to gradually build it out to a free trade area of the Asia Pacific, and that remained the goal of the countries that joined. For us, another important goal was finding a way to enhance our competitiveness globally. So we're looking at trade as a means of increasing economic growth and supporting job creation. And in doing so, we want to ensure that we're finding ways to enhance U.S. competitiveness. Part of that relates to the number of trade agreements that were being negotiated by other countries. So other countries were developing preferential access that was going to put us at a disadvantage at the same time as we were not using trade agreements in ways that would advance areas where we could, where we are most competitive. So those were the goals that we had when we joined. And when we joined, there were 5 countries that quickly grew to 7 when Australia and Peru joined, and then Malaysia and Vietnam joined, and just in October, Canada and Mexico joined. So we're now up to 11 countries. The agreement is open to all APEC members, all 21 APEC economies, and it is by self-selection that you express your interest. You're not invited to join the TPP. If you're an APEC member and you're interested in joining, you express that interest to other countries who then consider whether you're ready to meet the standards of the agreement. And that's how all of us have come to the table. Let me just spend a few minutes, and I know we don't have a lot of time. What are some of the things that are different about TPP, and in some ways get at the issue of why is this hard, or what are some of the challenges? This is a high standard agreement, higher than most of the agreements being negotiated globally, not necessarily the agreements the US has negotiated, but many of the agreements that other countries have negotiated. And we are seeking to have a comprehensive agreement on the goods side, which is the goal that we've set for all of our FTAs, but that other countries don't necessarily keep to. But also to have an ambitious outcome on services and investment, because we are so competitive in the services sectors, as well as in government procurement. There have been lots of studies on this, and all of them would demonstrate that the deeper the liberalization, the greater the benefits. So we are looking for a very deep agreement. We're also negotiating a regional agreement as opposed to a bilateral agreement. As I said, that has implications for what we do when we bring it up to Congress, but it also has very significant implications for those businesses and workers that are using the agreement. Because as we rationalize the agreements across the region, and as we seek to ensure that the benefits create linkages across the agreement, there are more significant benefits to us than there are from bilateral agreements. We are looking at cross-cutting issues that we have not looked at in previous agreements. So we are looking at things like regulatory issues. You know, tariff barriers are slowly coming down around the world and have been for some time, but it's the non-tariff barriers and regulatory issues that companies face that we really need to do significant work on and have been looking at carefully as key elements in TPP. We're also looking at other cross-cutting issues like competitiveness and supply chains, I think will be discussed later. how we integrate small and medium-sized enterprises into the trade agreements more effectively, and development issues and how to promote development. The agreement includes countries that are developed and developing, and we need to ensure that we are promoting development across the region so that we can encourage all of the countries, regardless of their level of development, to be able to join the TPP. We are looking at emerging issues in the global economy, and Bob has raised a couple of them that we're looking at. State-owned enterprises, or sometimes called state capitalism, is a new issue that we're looking at here that is quite important to us in the U.S. We are examining the trade distortions that can be caused by SOEs and how we discipline SOEs to ensure that there's a level playing field and that our companies are not disadvantaged by the increasing activity of SOEs in international trade. We're looking at digital economy issues. The U.S. is very competitive in this sector, so we have a number of areas that we're looking at related to the digital economy and new disciplines that we're including in the agreement related to e-commerce and related to intellectual property to ensure that those markets the markets in the TPP countries are open in this area where we're very competitive. And we have many other issues that we've looked at. In fact, we've gone through our traditional trade agreements and gone through every chapter to examine what is it that we want to do, and we could go through chapter by chapter, but I will save you that for now because we don't have time. We have also called this a living agreement, and this is a concept that we've brought to this because we have, as I said, 11 countries that are currently members of the TPP. We are looking to grow this out to countries across the Asia Pacific. So we are growing out in stages and tranches. So it will be a living agreement that grows both by adding new countries, but also by adding issues as new developments occur in the global economy that we need to take account of in the agreement. Why is this so complex? Well, I think you can see that it's a very complex agreement. It's grown in stages with different countries joining at different stages. But what we are trying to do is to integrate 11 economies with very diverse economic structures, different economic interests, different strengths. So immediately that's a difficult enterprise, even without all of the new issues that we're trying to think through as part of the agreement. A complicating factor in an agreement like this is the fact that we have bilateral trade agreements with many of the countries, and many of the other countries around the table have bilateral agreements with one another. So we are taking existing agreements and folding them into a new agreement and trying to figure out how to, in some cases, rationalize that, in some cases, supersede what was done in a previous agreement. But all of that needs to be thought through in terms of the implications of the pre-existing agreement with the new agreement, and it's quite complicated. The fact that we're trying to make this a regional agreement is also important and one of the hallmarks of the agreement, but is a very complex exercise. So we're taking things like the rules of origin that guide decisions about which products are considered as originating under the agreement, which products have the benefits of the agreement, can enter duty-free under the terms of the agreement. And taking about 11,000 lines of tariffs and negotiating each rules of origin for each of them across 11 countries into a single schedule. So it's time-consuming and detail-oriented, and in some cases where there are sensitive products, very, very controversial. There are 27 chapters to the agreement. So we have, at the moment, around 500 negotiators from all of these 11 countries negotiating these different commitments on all of these chapters. A very, very complex exercise, and one that I think is significantly more complicated, exponentially more complicated than negotiating a bilateral trade agreement. And let me just say a word of where we are and what's the outlook. And I think I'll be out of time.
No, go ahead. Yes,
Okay.
I see time to you.
Okay. We have been negotiating now for 2 years with in the current configuration. So since the Obama administration relaunched these negotiations, we've been negotiating now for about 2 years. We are about to enter our 16th round of negotiations in Singapore. And people say, 16 rounds, why aren't you done yet? I think it's very difficult for people to understand who haven't participated in a trade negotiation why it would take so long to negotiate some of the rules that are related to texts that have been around for some time. But we are all looking to raise the standards here. So in many cases, we have come to the table with 11 countries coming with 11 competing texts. And we all put our text down on the table, and people have to figure out how to put those all together into one negotiating text and then negotiate off of that text. So it is complicated to get just to the stage where you're actually negotiating, where you're actually at a point where you can negotiate off of one document. We have in many cases developed new ideas and new texts that has taken some time, and for those of you that are Hill staff here, you know that we've been up here quite a bit talking to you about some of the new areas that we have proposed for the text. So developing those and getting consensus domestically takes some time, and then putting them on the table where we are pushing the envelope in new areas is something other countries want to consider very seriously before they're willing to agree to those. At this point, we have many chapters close to conclusion, and we have had many intersessional meetings between the formal negotiating rounds to try to advance the work that we do at the formal negotiating rounds. President Obama is engaged and speaks regularly to his TPP counterparts in other countries, as do the ministers, Ambassador Kirk and other cabinet officials who speak to their counterparts to try to push specific issues on the agenda. So I am comfortable and confident that we have the commitment of senior level leaders to move this toward closure as quickly as we can. We will go to Singapore in a couple weeks to try to continue to make progress, and then we have a APEC trade ministers meeting in Indonesia in April, where we will again take stock and try to move the process forward. We have set a goal of finishing the negotiations this year, and we are doing everything we can to achieve that. If you asked me to list what I think the obstacles for that are, it would be a long list. But I think what we're doing now is to focus on our common goals and our commitment to get this done and to work through the issues as quickly as we can.
That's good.
Thanks.
Okay. Before we go to Rick, I'd like to ask those who wish to come over here. There are a couple seats, 2 in the front row and 3 in the second row. If not, stay there. Come on. Nope, they don't want to. Okay, so Rick Johnston.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Rick Johnston. Very pleased to be here. Brad and Bob, thank you so much for organizing this. I'm here today really in my capacity as one of the co-chairs, of which there are several, of the TPP Business Coalition. I'm not going to necessarily be speaking, therefore, about just the benefits to what one might call the financial services sector, but why business community in general sees this particular negotiation as probably the high watermark for U.S. trade negotiations going forward, and that includes past negotiations. I think as Barbara's pointed out, as Bob pointed out, this is an evolutionary kind of an agreement. It's building, and this is something that is sometimes lost on people who see this as maybe a way of avoiding the WTO. What it's really doing is building on the basic frameworks that are embodied in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and the World Trade Organization agreements. It's really important to understand that, because a lot of people think this is some sort of U.S. Effort to circumvent, and it's really not. And I think from the business community's point of view, it's critical that we still maintain a multilateral system. But in this context, as for all the good reasons that I've just been explained to you, this particular negotiation takes advantage of the possibility of really reaching new levels of commitment, not just, of course, in tariffs, which after 50 years of multilateral trade rounds, the tariff is not the big issue, at least for us in the U.S. business community, as much as it is the non-tariff barrier. And a new term that I think many of you might be running across in your reading on this topic now is the behind-the-border barrier, which has a lot to do with regulatory controls by host governments, has a lot to do with conditions that once you're invested, you then find it very difficult to actually take advantage of the capital you've put into the country. So the TPP, it really does evidence on a large scale what can be useful commitments on the part of the other participating countries in not totally removing, of course, but reducing these behind-the-border barriers. One of the things that I find in conversations throughout town too, and I would suggest it to your thinking, that is when you hear the word trade in today's business world, at least for the United States and competitiveness, it doesn't mean just goods moving across borders. It doesn't even just mean services moving across borders. It also means investment. And that's something where the TPP is really going to make a big difference. It's going to set some very important standards, God willing, for how the rest of the world can look at the kind of standards that really makes a difference in helping economies develop. In some ways, as you just heard, the Doha round, of course, stalled out. But in some ways, the Doha agenda, which we all hear is still alive and well, can well be served by the TPP. And we in the U.S. business community are first to recognize this because of what it offers, as I say, not only in trade in goods and services, but also in these investment style issues. I think, too, the TPP is an interesting historical development because it sort of represents a hearkening back to when the Dutch, back in the 15th century, first adopted the most favored nations trading principle. That was in reaction. The Dutch sort of saw this cacophony, if you will, of regulations and trade barriers that all of its various trading partners had with it and vice versa. And the Dutch said to themselves, you know, why don't we simplify this? Why don't we sort of wipe the slate clean and basically offer a most favored nations trading status for countries that wish to reciprocate with us? And the TPP, in my mind, is, in some ways, I'm sure it wasn't intended to be this way, but it's going to have, I hope, the effect of the same effect. In other words, it's going to say, let's rationalize all of these rules, as Barbara said. Let's try to make a set, if you will, level playing field. Let's reduce this discriminatory aspect that all these various bilateral agreements are developing. I practiced international trade law here for 30 years in Washington, and I have to say it was a great practice because of all of these various rules and regulations. I mean, today for a company to want to do business in 3 different countries requires a lot of research. It's not a predictable environment as it used to be, or as it can be. And I think the TPP recognizes that. And you know, I still sit in awe of Barbara and her team in terms of pulling all of this together and trying to make it make sense in a more predictable way. And for U.S. business, the word predictable is 90% of the battle. We can deal with things that otherwise are at elevated cost, but it's that unpredictability of that cost that makes our business planning difficult. And as you can imagine, if you're sitting on a board of directors, you want to know what the year is going to look like. You don't want this big surprise all of a sudden saying, well, I'm sorry, but you can't move your capital out of our country now. Or you can't actually adopt a certain type of legal structure for how you want to do business. So, doink. Bob has that subtle touch. I'm glad you didn't hit me or something. Thanks. Let me conclude then by pointing out that there are the following issue areas that we think in the U.S. business community are particularly important, cutting-edge areas for all of us to pay close attention to as this thing winds to a hopefully positive close. One is the TPP addresses e-commerce, which is obviously trying to address, if you will, in a 21st century context, technological changes that have changed the way people do business. Cross-border data flow, which you might consider folded into that, but for us in the financial services business, but also in the services sector in general, we are digitally enabled companies in the United States today that are competitive in world markets because of that, more than anything else. And if we cannot protect our ability to move data across borders and to process that data where it's most efficient and to store the data, again, where it's most efficient, we're going to lose competitiveness. Supply chain logistics is another area where we're starting to look at it, and I think Barbara can speak to this far better than anybody else, but it's within a supply chain and value chain system that we really need to focus how we break down barriers. That the TPP is starting to do. State-owned enterprises, of course. And then last but not least, regulatory coherence, which addresses to a large extent that behind the borders problem that I mentioned. So just short and sweet of it is, the TPP really is setting that high water level for all these trade negotiations. And I would suggest look at the TPP because you're going to see a lot of that in the International Services Agreement. You'll probably see a lot of it creep into the US-EU negotiation, which rumor has it might be endorsed by the president tonight. So the TPP is the thing to watch, and you know, we in the business community are doing our best to support Barbara and her team to reach the expectations we hope we can achieve. Thanks.
Rick, thank you very much. Steve.
So I'm coming at this from the perspective of the apparel and footwear industry. We're kind of the poster child for the globalized industry. We're often told that we're on the front lines of globalization. Our members sit on top of a global supply chain and they service global markets. We are often reminded that 95% of the people that wear clothing live outside of the United States, and we aim to make sure that every one of them are dressed. We like to say that our members buy everywhere, they make everywhere, and they sell everywhere. And that changes on a daily, monthly, weekly, yearly basis. The makeup of their markets and the makeup of their suppliers. At the end of the day, we're getting inputs from pretty much everywhere, from the United States, from other countries as well. When you look just at the US market too, it's important to realize that we're not the same industry that a lot of people think we were. On the apparel side, we're about 98% import penetration. On the footwear side, we're about 99% import penetration. Yet we employ 4 million US workers in a variety of activities, some manufacturing, but also design, compliance, intellectual property, distribution, logistics, you name it. So these are 4 million US workers that at the end of the day pretty much owe their job based on imports, as well as the stuff they produce here in the United States. The industry also has been typically marked with fairly high protection. Some of it has gone away over the years, some of it is still around. In the apparel industry, we had a system of worldwide quotas, which expired in 2005. Both apparel and footwear, you still have fairly high duties that we assess, and you find a lot of these protections that exist in other countries as well. So it's an industry that's really ripe for liberalization whenever we can get it. But just in the US, if you look at it, and Ed's always good at these numbers too, about 50% of the revenues that the customs collects is collected on textiles, apparel, and footwear, yet we represent about 6 to 7% of the imports by value coming in. So that's a pretty lopsided arrangement. And those high duties have persisted even though we've had a proliferation of free trade agreements, because companies on either the apparel or the footwear side haven't been able to use those free trade agreements, either because they've been with partners that don't have that industry, or because the rules are difficult, or the rules are complicated, or the rules are just hard to use. When we look at the TPP, we take that perspective, and we're looking for a variety of things to come out of this. One is diversification. When I mentioned those numbers about what our import share, the dominant supplier for footwear and a large supplier for apparel comes from China. And so members who like their partnership with China, but they also don't want to have all their eggs in one basket, are constantly looking to diversify. And the TPP countries create additional opportunities to diversify. We're looking to opportunities to lower duties. With the free trade agreement does come a market access schedule where duties do progressively get lowered. We're looking to open up export markets. And when I talk about export markets, I'm not talking just about exporting from the United States to another country. Our members and our industry, we export from one country to another. So we export from the US to other countries, from other countries to the US, and from other countries to other countries. Like I said, we produce everywhere and we sell everywhere. We've got a harmonization objective here, and I'm basically going to just channel the comments that Rick made. Very important, some of the regulatory coherence, trying to come up with common customs platforms, simplifications, predictability, very important for our members and for our industry. We also view the TPP as a great opportunity to build on some of the regional integration activities that have been going on in the ASEAN countries already. Very important for our members. They've already been doing a lot of business there, and they see this as an opportunity to grow that. And finally, we like to see this as an opportunity to make an agreement that's future-proof. And ideally, we really see that coming in two places. One is, Barbara mentioned the P4, which was not an agreement that attracted anybody except for the United States. Our hope is that when she's finished her fine work, this is an agreement that attracts everybody, that everybody wants to sign on. And there's obviously some evidence of that, of other countries kind of circling the wings and indicating some interest in a number of potential suitors. We'd love to see this expanded throughout Asia. We'd love to see this expanded in Latin America. A lot of countries that we'd like to see eventually join. The other way we would like to see this future-proofed is to make sure that the agreement is timeless, that the provisions make sense even if nobody joins going into the future. So with that, I'm going to just give us the three. I got to you before the card came over. Just to kind of sort of answer, I guess, your three questions, or the 3 points that you posed. One is you talk about what's kind of the most important, and I would kind of group it all together and say we want to make sure this agreement is usable on day one and usable on 20 years and day one. So in other words, it's still going to be as relevant 20 years from now, 30 years from now as it is today. Number two, we're very pleased to see, at least I'm going to look just from the apparel perspective, that the conversation has centered a lot on flexibility. We're in the process of this short supply exercise. You've probably been reading a little bit about that in the press. And this is something that we've been encouraging people to participate in, to be very active in. It's a very good discussion. I think it's one that we need to have as part of this, and we're looking forward to the outcome of all that. Flexibility is a really important term for the global supply chain because, as I mentioned, our supply chains are changing from year to year. And then third, the obstacle, I think probably the biggest obstacle, is the extraordinary complication that's part of this exercise. New countries are joining. I can't imagine the difficulty it was to bring Mexico and Canada in. Yet the single biggest comment I heard in Auckland in December was how, and no pun intended, I'm in the apparel industry, how seamless it was to integrate those countries in. They did their homework and they came into the process, and the negotiations didn't miss a beat. So I took that as a very good sign that perhaps we can reach this October goal despite the complications and difficulties. Thanks.
Steve, thank you very much. Ed Gresser.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. I guess as the final speaker, I've listened with a lot of interest and learned a lot. Maybe I'll go back to the opening question and try to examine the question of it. Can the U.S. negotiate a high-standard Trans-Pacific partnership? You can define high standard in a lot of ways. I think probably the answer in any particular case would be yes, but let me review three of them and then get to a question that isn't so much about high standards, but is about the relevance of the agreement to Congress and to the public today. High standard agreement, first, could be an agreement that is, as both Rick and Steve are saying, is good for the long term. If you look at trade really from 1950 to about 2000, you could see two really big things happen. One was trade grew relative to the economy as trade barriers shrank. The other is that manufacturing trade, starting roughly level with agriculture and resources, became much bigger, largely because of the decrease in manufacturing tariffs, and the invention of container shipping. Next 20 years, I guess, is going to have a similar phenomenon in services because of the invention of the internet. And as Rick was saying, the ability of businesses, whether you're a hospital or a entertainment company or a bank or whatever, to be serving global markets through the movement and storage and dissemination of data. And TPP, I believe, is the first agreement really to try to take up this issue and provide predictable and strong rules that will allow this to happen. This, again, as Rick says, is an area where the U.S. is particularly strong and maybe offers us some real long-term opportunities. A second form of high standards is the agreement good for shoppers? Is it good for consumers here in the U.S.? Steve has pointed to one of the big facts about American trade policy, which is that in some ways it's a way of taxing life necessities. If you are buying clothes and shoes, if that comes to a large part of your budget, you're probably a low-income family. And that is where we've concentrated most of our tariff system. That is about $16 billion out of $30 billion in tariff collection. And for the public, it's probably a cost of about $50 billion a year. Do we want to keep this system? Or are there ways to reform and make it easier for families in general, and particularly for poor families? Open question whether that will happen through TPP or not. Third way to define high standard, is it sort of comprehensive? Does it deal with the range of issues that come up in people's minds and people think are important? Is it usable by all of the members? And there, I think, at least in the outline, you have a lot of attention to trade facilitation, a lot of attention to capacity building for the lower income and smaller countries who are being asked to sign up to an agreement that's going to be about that high and has many, many sort of really sophisticated regulatory systems that aren't easy to implement, have very advanced content on labor and environment, very advanced capacity building. So yeah, this has a potential of being a very comprehensive and deep integration agreement. But I think, if I were still working for Mr. Conti, as I proudly did, he was a unique personality and one of the great members of Congress. What I would be asking myself is, what does this mean at home? Why is this? Is this interesting? Was it relevant to the people who are calling me on the phone? And here, I definitely think it is. U.S. has a big problem, which is that we are slow growth and high unemployment economy ever since the financial crisis. Why is that? I think there is a big objective fact about family life in America that is at the bottom of our problem in recovery. This is that the crisis destroyed about $5 trillion in family wealth. Families had close to $12 trillion in assets embodied in homes before the crisis. Now they have about $7 trillion. That's up from 6 at the worst point, but it's still very, very low. They've lost a lot of money. Those are homes that people are counting on for retirement, for security and job loss. They can't count on that anymore, so they're continuing to save money. They're not buying a lot of new houses. They're not buying a lot of new cars. Ergo, the economy continues to be slow. If you have slow consumption, you can substitute government spending and stimulus for a while. We've done that. We can argue about whether it was successful or not. I tend to think it was, but it's not very popular and probably not going to happen again. The only other alternative, if you're looking for a source of growth, is to find foreigners to buy more American things. If you're not going to get it from shoppers and you're not going to get it from government, you have to do it through export. Over the past decade, we've done a lot of FTAs. Those FTAs together, as of last year, were the market for about $140 billion in American exports. The TPP countries are the market for about $750 billion. That is about a third of our exports. If you add to that a negotiation with the EU, trade agenda will be dealing not with 140 billion, about 7% of exports, but about 65 or 70%. That's a pretty big agenda. And if we are going to recover, we have to have a big agenda. So in that sense, if I was still in my job as in LA and thinking, is this relevant? I'd say, yeah, our businesses need someone to sell to, and this is a significant opportunity. If you're talking about Mexico and Canada, talking about Australia, Singapore, who knows, Japan, yeah, that amounts to a lot. Let me close there.
Well, thank you very much. That gives us a lot to think and talk about. So I'll turn to the audience for questions, and welcome your comment as well. Right here in the front row.
Well, this isn't an area where I know a great deal, so I'm just curious about one dynamic.
Maybe you could identify yourself.
My name's Andrew McDowell. I work with Edelman Public. You mentioned that Canada and Mexico came on board with regard to the negotiations in October.
So that's a good question. Let me just footnote something that Ed said about, before I answer that question, the contribution of exports to U.S. economic growth, which I think is a very important point as to why this is important. And I asked for these numbers from our econ office this morning because I thought this might come up, that since the lowest point in our, that the economy fell in the second quarter of 2009, exports have contributed 39% to U.S. growth. So I think that the point that you're making on the significance of exports and what we're trying to do with the trade agenda is very significant for all of the members, but all of the consumers in the United States and workers. On Canada and Mexico coming last year, there are many countries that were involved in a lot of trade negotiations around the world, and Canada and Mexico had been involved in their own negotiations. Canada's negotiating with the EU and other countries and looking to expand its trade with Asia. Mexico has been focused a bit on its trade in Latin America, but also looking to expand its trade in Asia. And I think we're convinced over time that the TPP might be the mechanism through which they could best do that. So as we began moving the process forward and the group got larger, I think that there was enough discussion internally in those countries to convince them that they should seek to join the TPP. They asked initially to be considered in November of 2011. And we had discussions with them through the better part of 2012 about the standards of the agreement and some of the specific issues that we have with them that we thought might complicate the negotiations and wanted to work through before we agreed to allow them to have a seat at the table. And so we did that through a good part of 2012 and then finally agreed that we were ready to have them join. The other countries had their own bilateral processes with both Canada and Mexico. So when we all finally agreed that all of the 9 countries were ready to bring them to the table, it was last September.
Good.
It will affect NAFTA in some ways, but it's difficult to say at this point. This is one of the complex issues here. How does the TPP affect the pre-existing agreements? So in some cases, we know exactly how things will be affected because we've concluded elements of the negotiations. In other places, we don't know because we have to finish the TPP to know. And what relationship there will be between NAFTA and TPP will depend on specific issues. So some people, for instance, have looked at things like the NAFTA side agreements on labor and said, well, what will happen to all of the apparatus that was established in NAFTA to implement the labor side agreements? Mm-hmm. Well, we haven't decided that yet. That's something the countries will have to discuss and determine in consultation with everybody who will have a view on that issue. And then there are other specific issues that similarly will need to be discussed. Some seem very apparent to the parties that it makes sense to have the TPP supersede NAFTA, but in other cases, it will make sense to have the agreements live side by side And we have to work all of that through as the negotiation moves toward closure.
Very interesting. Jim Berger.
Jim Berger, Washington Trade Daily. Barbara, you mentioned that there's some
Chapters.
yeah, sorry,
Chapters.
chapters here close to being finalized.
It varies by chapter. So there's every level of different issues. So sometimes it's a question of a complication between two countries that have a particular issue between them that needs to be worked out before they can sign on to the overall obligations in the text. Sometimes it's that most of the issues in the text are really not that controversial, and we're all the way through, and there's one or two issues that remain, and we are still trying to work them through, but they may need to be elevated at some point or set aside until later. A trade negotiation with this many chapters has sequencing issues. So some of the very sensitive issues that one or more countries have need to be sequenced with sensitive issues of other countries so they can all be balanced in a package. And all of that is worked through in the course of negotiations. Well, I think Rick made the point that we all are building off of the agreements that existed before. So we have started with the GATT, and we've built our bilateral trade agreements from commitments that were originally in the GATT. And with each successive generation of agreements, we look to see what worked and what didn't, and how we can build on what already existed. This is a regional agreement that includes a number of countries around the Pacific Rim who are trying to work together to raise the standard in the Pacific Rim. Now we are going to take that group of countries that are like-minded and bring the high standard that we have agreed to here into another forum where we together can work to raise the standard with a different set of countries. So we hope that they're mutually reinforcing.
Sam Knight. I'm a reporter for the website truthout.org.
The what? The
Website truthout.org.
Truth Out. Okay.
My question.
Good question, something that's been a conversation point for ever since TPP started. As you know, for example, there is no trade negotiating authority that Congress has given to the president. So what the administration has been doing thus far has been following through on one of the things the trade negotiating authority by law requires of the administration, which is to consult. And while the specific provisions are to consult with Congress, one of the things that the Trade Representative's Office fully understands is consultations with the private sector is key, because with a trade agreement, if you don't have the business community supporting the idea of the United States participating in that agreement, it's very likely not to happen. So the Trade Representative's Office, Barbara and her team, have been very, very forthcoming to the extent they can in talking with us about how this agreement, how this negotiation is going forward. We feel in the coalition very, very pleased, very grateful with the amount of time and energy that the people at USTR devote to trying to keep us apprised, trying to test us and determine what works, what doesn't work. It's difficult because these are negotiating texts. The negotiators are constrained in terms of what they can share with us. One very useful reality, however, is that if you go to look at the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, which is one of the last and best of our free trade agreements, you get a very good idea of what was the starting point for the TPP. It certainly is not going to be the TPP, but at least for those of us who are trying to get a sense of what is this thing looking like, how is this going to read, that's a good sort of reference point. So I guess I'd just simply say I think it's, to the extent it's been possible, they've done everything they possibly can to keep us involved. It's a symbiotic relationship in many ways for political reasons, if nothing else. But obviously, the United States government is in this to help, as has been mentioned here at the table, to help U.S. exports, to help market access, to help the business community thrive. And that's what it's all about, and we know that, and we're sort of part of a team. Granted, we're not first string in terms of on the front lines of the negotiations, but we try to. I think by this engagement, it's been a mutually reinforcing effort.
Steve?
I think it's been a fairly active discussion from the get-go. One thing that I'd forgotten to mention I wanted to highlight, which is that at each of the rounds, I think dating with Singapore, maybe before the first Singapore, there's been opportunities for stakeholders to present and interact with the negotiators, not just the U.S. government negotiators, but the other negotiating teams as well, in a variety of different fora. And it's been, I think there's been a lot of experimentation, and I've heard some very positive feedback from a variety of the groups that have gone and participated in that. And just personally, I've witnessed the chief negotiators participating, including Barbara, participating in those fora as well. So it's not just show, it's actually stuff. You really see engagement and discussion going on at the rounds themselves and supplementing what occurs in between the rounds.
Ed, do you want to comment on that? Okay.
First, I want to say that I don't think that we would necessarily agree with your characterization of the IMF report, although we have obviously been discussing it and are studying it, but we wouldn't necessarily characterize it the way that you have as projecting a particular policy position that they're advocating. I also would not characterize what's going on at the negotiating table, despite what you may have read in various publications around town. All of these issues are active issues, and they're very important issues, as has been indicated by the question that was asked about the engagement with stakeholders. We engage with stakeholders from the business community, from the NGO community, consumer groups, all stakeholders that represent lots of different interests, and we're spending quite a bit of time up here on the Hill. I personally spend quite a bit of time up here on the Hill, and we know that there are different perspectives on a lot of these issues, and they are important policy issues. So as we determine how we're going to go forward on a specific issue like this, there will be continued discussion with the committees who have jurisdiction over that issue here on the Hill, as well as with stakeholders who have an interest on that issue. But exactly how we're going to resolve that issue in the room, I can't say right now, and we will continue discussing it.
Steve Simchak, American Insurance Association.
Thank you. Well, I guess I need no introduction for myself. And the discussion of stakeholders is interesting. I think one area.
How about Dr. Johnson? Just to put you on the spot, Rick.
Well, yeah, no, as Barbara pointed out, this is one of those new sort of cutting-edge types of topics. And I think the phrase state capitalism is apropos. I think the companies that are running up against the problem and the challenges of the state-owned enterprises they've obviously felt strongly enough about it that the problem is being addressed within the negotiations. How it's going to ultimately flesh out, in my mind, is one of the big question marks in the TPP negotiation, because you've got such a diverse array of economies that are at the table. Frankly, and again, I'm sort of using a bit of hearsay here, but it sounds to me like, for example, Vietnam, where you'd think that would be a real big problem, is less of a problem in the negotiations than some other participating countries. So even the United States government has some problems with what these provisions are going to be in terms of the disciplines by which state-owned enterprises conduct themselves in a business context. I have to say, I find it as a lawyer a little sort of strange that this this issue has popped up, because as a matter of international law, when you have a sovereign entity or an instrumentality of a sovereign government working and doing business in a commercial manner, international law recognizes that you will treat them within your court system as a business, and there is no sovereign immunity there, which is a principle in international law that is otherwise conveyed to a sovereign entity or instrumentality when it's acting on behalf of the state. So the concept of state-owned enterprises in business is hardly something new, at least in the law. Now, as a matter of a trade negotiation and of sovereign governments committing on a broad generic context for what will be acceptable conduct versus a constraint that could be enforceable, that's new, that's groundbreaking, and I think that's, as I say, there are so many different ways by which these parties are negotiating on this particular topic that I really feel like I know the least about what the outcome will be on state-owned enterprises.
Just thought I'd add, for people that aren't following this issue, what the real issue is with SOEs. So we all have SOEs in our market, and we aren't.
The United States has some too.
Yeah, I mean, including the United States, and we aren't trying to suggest that there's anything in particular wrong with SOEs. I mean, SOEs are created for lots of purposes. We have lots of SOEs to address market failure, or to cover certain public services that wouldn't otherwise be covered by the private sector. But what has happened in recent years is that some SOEs that would operate domestically to address these kinds of issues that emerge in an economy have started to trade more internationally and become state commercial enterprises. So they are competing directly with private enterprises, and often in a way that's considered unfair. So some of the advantages that can be conferred on state-owned enterprises are things like preferential financing, that wouldn't be, rates that wouldn't be provided to private companies, preferential provision of goods and services by a government, where political influence is used to force certain kinds of decisions that would benefit a country's own domestic economy, where they would have special regulations that would apply to a state-owned enterprises to give it advantages over its private competitors. So when we see those kinds of things, the benefits that we're seeking to negotiate in an agreement like TPP get undermined if the state-owned enterprises, which in some cases can comprise a significant percentage of an economy, can be used to undermine what we're trying to otherwise gain from this trade agreement. So what we're trying to do here is both discipline the kinds of advantages that can be conferred on these SOEs, the ones that are competing in the commercial sphere, but also ensure that there's transparency in the way that they conduct their business, so you know whether or not you're competing on a level playing field. And if you're not, then there are mechanisms in the agreement then you can use to address this problem. And I think it is a growing problem for us, and one that many of the countries are interested in pursuing. Just about, I think 2 weeks ago, there was an article in The Economist about the Vietnamese economy looking to try to address the problem in its economy of how SOEs were affecting its competitiveness, and what they were trying to do to reform their SOEs in order to ensure that they could become competitive in the region. So they, in fact, are supporters of looking to do something in this for that reason.
As Barbara has pointed out, and others have as well, this agreement is unique because it includes economies at a number of different levels of development. So I'd like to apologize to Virginia Foote and ask her to comment on the benefits to Vietnam, countries like Vietnam, including Vietnam, of this agreement. Now, Virginia is the president of the U.S.-Vietnam Business Councils, is that the right word? Title. Spent a number of years in Washington, is now living in Hanoi doing her work. And would you? Sure. I think you could use that microphone if you wanted to. You might press the button.
Barbara made some very important points, I think, about the diversity of the U.S. on the one hand and Vietnam on the other. Vietnam's per capita is about $1,500 a year, so it's a huge gap, top to bottom, of the countries in TPP. But I think it has two, maybe three really important aspects. One is Vietnam's sort of general business practice standards are a little bit sloppy, a little bit out of sync with some of the other standards in the other countries. So this is a way for the reform in Vietnam to go from what they had done 5 years ago to join the WTO to now really up their game and get more competitive and get their standards up to the next generation. The other is the obvious thing of the products that Vietnam needs, produces, exports. The U.S. is a huge market for Vietnam, and having greater access to the U.S. market, footwear and apparel being two of their very important exports. And the third is, I think, sort of reputational, that the last couple of years globally, you know, as the U.S. economy has suffered, other economies, particularly Vietnam, have suffered a lot. And they haven't been making all the right decisions. And so just to see that a country that's been, you know, poor, floundering, emerging, developing, to take these global commitments could mean more investment and that Vietnam become a bigger player in the global economy. What incentives could, what are the incentives for Vietnam commercially? Apart from the points you've made, are they going to benefit by reason of exports and jobs? Is that because I'm not sure what they export besides shrimp, where we haven't been very kind to them, for example, and maybe catfish. We haven't.
I'm not sure.
We are tangled in some trade issues on shrimp, yes, and on catfish. They would like to see our tariffs go down on footwear and apparel. Those are big markets for them. Vietnam is about 8% of our market, so they're still relatively small. They'd like to see that grow. They also would like to see more foreign direct investment, and so standards for investment, getting their SOEs in shape, could mean that more companies come and invest in Vietnam, and they really need that.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
That was great. Anybody else? You've asked one already. Is there anybody else who'd like to jump in? Yeah, right there. Could you stand up? Can't hear you. McDonough School.
I'm wondering, like, sometimes how like-minded is a continuum.
Eye of the beholder.
So what we're looking for is countries that are seeking a high standard agreement. So the first principle is that we're looking for something comprehensive. Many trade agreements, as I said at the beginning, are not negotiated in that way. A lot of countries negotiate agreements that are focused on areas of their export interests, but anything that's sensitive, they want to carve out. That's not something that we're looking to do here. We don't think that we can achieve the goals that we've set unless the agreement's comprehensive. We're looking for countries that have interests not just on the goods sides, but also on services. Services is important to us, but it's also important to a lot of the other countries that are party to this agreement. And in general, across the agreement, having countries that are willing to take the next step to consider new disciplines and areas that are emerging in a lot of the areas that we discussed here. So there are different approaches to trade agreements. The United States has a very particular view about the way that we do this, in part because of the way that it has evolved in our relationship with Congress, but also because philosophically we believe trade is organic, that all of the pieces of the trade agreement fit together neatly, and if you don't have a strong services sector, then it won't support your goods, and if you don't have intellectual property, then you can't attract all of the pieces fit together. And we don't negotiate a goods agreement and then later on a services and later on investment the way some countries do. We negotiate it all as a single undertaking because we believe that that's the most effective way to deliver on the promises that we have for the trade agreements. The countries that are around the table similarly believe that. Now, we're going to have differences on lots and lots of specific issues because we approach things different ways and we all have to come to some kind of agreement that we can all live with. But as a general matter, these are countries that are in the forefront of free trade globally, that believe in the benefits of trade and are working to try to push the envelope, to use trade as a tool to support economic growth and development and to create jobs in their economies. And so they are very much like-minded in that regard.
I'd like to direct a question at Ed and some of the other two private sector representatives, and that is to say that we've made the case here today that this agreement is very important commercially, has tremendous potential for linking markets that are now not integrated into a global supply chain, into a global network, and or rather Trans-Pacific network. Some people have suggested that the agreement has strategic benefits, benefits beyond the economic, benefits that it might be part of a sort of pivot to Asia and a policy driven by the desire to isolate China. So I'm wondering, Ed and Steve and Rick, if I'm not going to embarrass Barbara by answering that question, but she can if she wants. What do you think about that?
That's a really interesting and kind of provocative question. On a listserv that is continually raising up the idea that TPP is part of a containment policy aimed at China. So here's my take on it. One, China cannot be isolated. China is the main industry and assembly platform for East Asia. It's probably going to keep that on going that way. Two, China, let me back up a bit. Over the past decade, what has gotten the most attention in Congress has been the series of FTAs we've been doing. However, I think personally the real center of American trade policy has been the effort, first through the Free Trade Area of the Americas and then through the Doha round, to reach some kind of mutually acceptable liberalizing agreements with China and Brazil and India. That did not work. They did not want to do it, or FTA didn't work. Doha round suspended animation. During the Obama administration, attempt to do the climate change agreement, same result. Constantly, when we did a big negotiating thing over the last decade, we wound up in a stalemate with one or two or all three of those countries. The TPP, and I think also if it happens, the US-EU agreement, seems to me to be a decision by the US to move them out of the center of policy for a while. Not to isolate them, but not to use all of our effort and all of our energy trying to negotiate something that in the end is going to lead up to a stalemate. I think that's, whether it's been done consciously or because that's what's available, I think is a good idea. And if there's some discomfort to China in not being a center of US trade policy, that's not necessarily a bad thing. If they conclude that this is an isolation and an encirclement and whatnot, if that's what they want to conclude, nobody can stop them from doing it, but it isn't true, and they should know very well it isn't true, because we've tried very hard to negotiate them through Doha. And I think the US government is doing the right thing. So that's my opinion and the answer to your question.
I would say a couple of things. One is I don't think it's really in anyone's interest to isolate China, certainly not in the US and not in our industry. China is in the top 3 export destinations for cotton, yarn, and fabric coming from the United States. It's kind of a dirty little secret. Nobody realizes how important a market it is for the textile industry, but it's been huge, and it's been growing over the last 10 years or so, pretty much since they joined the WTO. So from our perspective, we want to see more, not less, engagement with China. I think, too, when I've heard people talk about the TPP as being sort of a containment on China. I'm not sure the other countries necessarily all agree with that. I mean, some of these are countries that have agreements with China. They do business with China. They've also developed positive trade relationships with China. They've got investment. So I think certainly the other countries, I don't think, are viewing this from that perspective as well. Certainly people, they may have competitive interests vis-a-vis China and with respect to certain products or categories, but overall, I don't think anyone's trying to contain China, as I think for the point Ed mentioned, that it's impossible to do. In terms of a pivot, I would argue that the TPP is kind of a pivot to trade. It was interesting to hear Barbara talk about kind of the joining it for the second time, and then as well looking at 39, this comment about 39% of our U.S. growth is coming out of exports. So when you take the TPP, you combine it with the National Export Initiative. That's my prediction. We'll hear about that tonight in the State of the Union. But the effort to double exports, and then some of these other initiatives that are out there, the EU, US, and so forth, is an effort to kind of put the U.S. economy back into the international global trading sphere. So we're still negotiating these market access and market opening agreements. So that's kind of the way I would look at it.
Cool. Ricardo?
One observation about the word strategic. I think that we live in a world today where ecopolitics is what it's all about. We can project force, but if you don't have an economy that allows you to project force, you're going to ultimately not have much room for developing strategy. So I see the TPP, as well as virtually any other trade agreement we're negotiating, as a strategic move, as important to the United States as the economic side of it. With respect to China, the TPP is open, and if China wants to join, they're more than, I think, well, maybe not right now, but at some point.
Well, they're an APEC member. They can.
It's not a closed agreement.
Okay, I have just a few more minutes here. And I'm going to ask a question that has been suggested by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in a blog, a report on the Auckland trade round, TPP round. Basically a positive report, but says, however, we must still address some difficult topics if we are to reach the finish line. If we are to achieve our high ambitions in such areas as intellectual property, cross-border data flows, state-owned enterprises, the U.S. administration will have to screw up its courage and improve its market access offers. So, is that fair? Is that a fair commentary? I could ask if it's accurate, but.
This is, as I said, there's 29 chapters in this agreement, and they're all linked in some way, and the negotiations are carefully sequenced so we can accomplish all that we want to accomplish. The U.S. has been negotiating, this gets into more detail than people that are not tradies care about, but we are negotiating only with those countries with which we do not already have FTAs. So that is to say, if we already have an FTA with Australia and Chile and Peru and Singapore, we're not renegotiating the market access with them. We're negotiating with those countries we don't already have FTAs with. And those negotiations are being conducted bilaterally and at a pace that is responsive to the offers that we've gotten from the other countries. My own view is that is not an accurate characterization of what the state of play is with any of the particular countries, although I will say that these are important and sensitive issues with some of the countries. So for those of you who don't know what all that cryptic language means, what it means is the key country here is Vietnam. Vietnam is a very large market that we're looking to ensure that we have significant access in areas of interest to the United States. And Vietnam is interested in, as Jenny said, footwear and textiles, which is a sensitive areas for us. We are slowly making progress on a package that will be balanced and that addresses the offensive and defensive interests of both countries, but we have to do so in a way that is comfortable for both countries.
Well done. Okay, I think unless there's a feeling of wishing to comment further on the other members of the panel, I'll thank the panel, ask you to join me, please, in thanking this panel for an excellent conversation. Thank you. And thank you all for being here, and stay tuned.